When you study history, you come to expect that ruthless tyrants would be the type to advocate for violence and stripping both critics and minorities of their rights. But it's harder to understand why the average Joe would end up supporting their cause. Well, if you've ever had that thought, I think Rerir is someone who can give us an answer to that question. If you don't understand what I'm getting at, this video is gonna dissect Rerir's character in a way that examines what I think is his greatest flaw that brought his downfall. So if you haven't played Acts 3 and 4 of the Nod-krai Archon quest yet, then I recommend that you click off this video to avoid spoilers. In typical Genshin fashion, Rerir is a villain who is shown to have an origin story that paints him as someone sympathetic. I understand that some Genshin fans are a bit tired of this trend, as this whole trend of softening villains can admittedly get overdone. However, there is something very unique about Rerir's backstory, and that's the fact that when we first meet him in the flashback to his youth, we find out that he's been engaging in morally despicable crimes already. He's been hunting down and killing members of a clan at the whims of the Vinster King after all. So what makes him sympathetic isn't his innocence, but the moral dilemma he's faced with. It's either he leaves his current job as an assassin behind, which would require putting his own life in danger, or at the very least, overhauling his current living situation, or he sticks to his current occupation even as his own actions weigh down on his conscience, as long as it allows him to maintain the status quo of his stable life spent with his partner Tholindis. That dilemma makes him sympathetic because it's relatable. Not exactly relatable to us in our own personal lives, but we could imagine that if we were facing the same predicament as him, we wouldn't be able to do much different. But just because making a choice is difficult doesn't mean we become exempt from the responsibility attached to the outcomes of these choices. And what's worse is there are situations when not deciding still counts as a decision, and Rerir's situation is a perfect example of that. Even in moments when he thinks he can turn off his brain and ignore the morally abhorrent nature of his job, by showing up to work regularly, he passively decides to remain a killer. It's like sticking to your streaming platform subscription because you forgot to cancel after the free trial period. In a sense, the platform made the decision for you and you're just going with the flow, but because you always have the option to cancel your subscription, the fact that you're not doing so is a choice. The case is the same with Rerir. The option to leave his job always exists. Even if doing the right thing would lead to his death, the option will always still exist. And this is what makes him morally accountable for his murders, even if it's to a slightly lesser degree than that of the Vinster King, who was the true mastermind. If you think about it even more, Rerir actually has more options at his disposal than it would seem on the surface. It's not just a matter of sticking to his job or leaving it. He could decide to leave it by confronting the Vinster King or fleeing to any of the 7 nations. The latter might seem like an act of cowardice, but at least he gets to actively put a stop to the series of crimes he's committing, and he also weakens the manpower available to the king. And yet this doesn't even occur to him, not necessarily because he prefers working for the king, but I think he has tricked himself into believing that his circumstances have locked him into a certain path, which frees him from the consequences of his actions and frees him from the burden of having to decide his future. But we all know this is just a cognitive distortion meant to help him cope with the painful reality of his situation. It's only through him finding out that Tholindis was a descendant of the Crimson Moon bloodline that he fully understood his sense of agency, because he knows he can't just kill his fiancée and justify it by thinking of himself as the king's weapon. He began to recognize through this quandary that he can find a way not to kill her. But if he didn't have any personal relationship with any of his assigned targets, then he likely would have continued deluding himself into accepting his circumstances through the justification that either he has no choice or he's doing the right thing for the greater good of Khaenri'ah, even if deep down he knows it isn't true. Now, this example in itself isn't the only manifestation of Rerir's greatest flaw. Instead, I think Rerir's issue lies in how he pursues the same pattern of thinking across multiple situations. Now, I would like to introduce you to the concept of bad faith, or mauvaise foi in French. It's the term French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre used to describe this phenomenon I talked about, where people deceive themselves into thinking that they don't have the freedom to make choices. As Neil Burton from Psychology Today phrased it, by sticking with a safe, easy default choice and failing to recognize the multitude of other options that are available to him, a person places himself at the mercy of the circumstances in which he happens to find himself. The parents he had, the time and place society he was born into, the done or expected thing for someone like him. Like I said, we all do this to some degree, but I believe Rerir takes it to greater heights. We see that through his vulnerability to Vedrfolnir's premonitions, which made him more likely to get swayed by Vedrfolnir's words. Of course, on the surface, he was quite stubborn with staying in a relationship with Tholindis, giving us the impression that he still maintains a strong sense of agency. But he continues to be bothered by Vedrfolnir's premonitions, enough for him to ask for advice from him repeatedly. This is why in the moment when he rescued Vedrfolnir, he decided his next few actions based on Vedrfolnir's advice. That's not to say it's necessarily bad for him to take the advice of a prophet, because Vedrfolnir's visions were indeed accurate, but I believe this continued reliance on Vedrfolnir's advice is something that contributed to his downfall. He clings to the words of a prophet because he thinks that fate is something that binds him, but he doesn't realize that fate is just a prediction. What will happen in the future will happen kind of because of him. It's just that Vedrfolnir has a bit of an insight into what might happen because of some of Rerir's choices. Fortunately, Rerir did become aware of his sense of agency when he decided that he would ask the Vinster King for a pardon to allow him to protect Tholindis. So it's not like he always acts in bad faith, but still he got into Dainsleif's plot kinda half-heartedly. He himself said, "You have noble ambitions, Dane, but I'm afraid they don't do much for a guy like me. I'm not interested in saving the world, all I want is a letter of pardon." So while yes, he had his own motivations and was acting on them, in a sense he kinda only got dragged into the operation, and that put him in a position where he ended up taking more advice from Vedrfolnir as he was attempting to rescue him, which only increased his despair. If Rerir had maybe visited the Vinster King on his own, or if Rerir hadn't been assigned to rescue Vedrfolnir, Vedrfolnir might not have invited him to the palace to claim a share of the abyssal power. Who knows? Speaking of which, the final straw was his response to witnessing Tholindis sacrifice herself. This is where I think many people's analysis of Rerir would start to strongly diverge from mine. It's easy to think that Rerir succumbed to the temptation of the abyss and descended into evil because of Tholindis' tragedy, but I would argue that it's more of his attitude that led to his complete corruption. This is because I believe it is possible to respond to tragedy differently, given your own personal values. For instance, Kazuha lost a dear friend which you could sorta interpret as being his lover, yet it wasn't something that triggered him to pursue a crazed kind of vengeance because, one, that wasn't in his character or disposition, and two, he framed the situation as like, oh, my friend died for a cause, so I should consider supporting this cause too, rather than being like, oh, my friend died, therefore other people need to suffer too. Kazuha is the kind of person who follows his own principles and stays true to himself, while Rerir is kind of fickle without a stable set of principles aside from his attachment to Tholindis. Because of that, he's someone who can be more easily swayed by his own frustrations, which made it easier for the other four sinners to persuade him to take his share in the new abyssal power they acquired, whereas Dainsleif, someone who's more guided by his own beliefs, was able to resist the temptation despite seeing his nation crumble and his own brother suffer from his prophetic abilities. This is what I meant when I talked about Rerir's reliance on Vedrfolnir's advice. Because he felt like he couldn't trust his own judgment and sought it out from Vedrfolnir, it became easier for him to be convinced to join the other four sinners, as his brain was already conditioned to taking advice from other people rather than his own self. On the surface, Rerir claiming his new abyssal powers seems like an assertion of agency, showing that he's willing to find ways and means to defy fate to save Tholindis. But I think in reality, his decision wasn't born out of a sense of personal power, but a sense of hopelessness instead. He felt the need to cling on to this abyssal power because he likely didn't believe that there was any way for him to carve out his own fate without the help of this incredibly potent source of power, no matter how corrosive it may be. And that's the true tragedy of Rerir. It's not simply about a man losing the love of his life, but it's about a man persistently undermining his own agency to the point that he allowed his life choices to be dictated by circumstances rather than his own will. In fact, I wonder if that's how he entered the quandary into the first place. Maybe instead of refusing his job as soon as it was offered to him, he accepted it believing that this was the only choice available to him, whether it be because of money or social expectations. This is only a speculation, but it doesn't seem so far off considering this recurring theme in his worldview. That's not to say this all had nothing to do with Tholindis. On the contrary, I think his reverence of Tholindis was an early indicator of his fragileness. Not saying that their love wasn't genuine or that him adoring Tholindis was a sign of weakness. Don't worry, this isn't a Sigma male podcast after all. But there's a point when his particular way of loving Tholindis seemed to turn from sweet to kinda obsessive. Except it wasn't the obsessive type of love, which became particularly harmful to her. Instead, he himself seemed to have become the casualty of his own obsession, along with the rest of Tivat, of course. You see, Rerir and Tholindis were a regular sweet couple in love at the start of the flashback, but as soon as Rerir becomes aware of Vedrfolnir's premonitions about their doomed romance, I think Rerir began to also view his relationship with Tholindis as a symbol of his struggle against fate. Because if you think about it, I think if it were some other lover boy who was in Rerir's situation, he would address it differently. If he found out that the love of his life was put in danger because of their relationship, then he might be inclined to sacrifice his own happiness to keep her safe. He might find a way to help her escape from Kanya so that the king won't find a way to hunt her down by commanding other assassins. But Rerir isn't only concerned about Tholindis' well-being alone. He's concerned about their relationship too, because I think he views it as pretty much the only good thing going on in his life, perhaps his source of salvation. And with Vedrfolnir's ominous prediction, Rerir was only more motivated to fight for their relationship instead of breaking up with Tholindis to protect her, lest he succumb to fate and prove Vedrfolnir right. I understand that maybe even if Rerir came clean about his job and offered to help Tholindis escape Khaenri'ah, she might not have agreed, but at least if he brought it up, then they would have had more options to choose from, and if he did this, it would allow him to get Tholindis' opinion on the situation as well. Of course, it's very difficult to get to that point, but I think someone with a stronger will might have at least tried it. And not to mention, as some people have pointed out, she's not innocent either because of her repeated rationalization of Rerir's actions, despite knowing that members of her own clan were being killed by him. But although Tholindis had this issue of rationalization, she seemed to have less problems with tapping into her sense of agency, as it seemed that she was the one who was more active in finding a solution for Rerir to live a normal life. Although it wasn't the most ideal solution and it entailed a huge sacrifice on Tholindis' end, her entering that portal was still a choice of her own, and I think Rerir couldn't fully wrap his head around that. I think he viewed Tholindis as some sort of damsel in distress or a victim of fate, which she is in a way, but her going through that portal was also her way of doing her best to make her own decision even within the confines of fate. But in truth, it's probably Rerir who felt more victimized by fate than she did. I mean, I understand where Rerir comes from. It's definitely not easy to witness someone else's sacrifice, especially on your behalf. It breeds a strong feeling of regret and guilt. Even Deshret felt the same way towards Nabu Malikata, and yet it's still important to recognize the agency of this person making the sacrifice so that their sacrifice won't be in vain. And yet, by becoming a sinner, I think Rerir might have disappointed Tolindis. I doubt this is what she would have wanted from him. So, ironically, I think by trying to save her, he might have not been the most respectful of her wishes. So, what I'm saying is, while his love and dedication for Tholindis is admirable, him turning it to the dark side for her isn't something that's meant to be romanticized, because there is a way to honor your lover and your principles at the same time, something which Rerir wasn't able to achieve. But just a little side note on Vedrfolnir, I'm not gonna blame him for what happened to Rerir, that would be bad faith too. But I feel like with how impressionable Rerir was, I feel like things could have turned out a bit differently if Vedrfolnir talked about Rerir's relationship with Tholindis a little bit differently. He sounded like an asshole when he told Rerir to let Tholindis go and find someone better. As critical as I am of Rerir, I do believe his love for Tholindis was genuine, and I don't think it's something easily replaceable. So by him framing it that way, I think it only made Rerir feel more hopeless and enraged by the situation. If perhaps Vedrfolnir said something about letting Tholindis go to find peace or to honor her wishes, then Rerir might have reframed the situation a bit differently and turned into a solemnly mournful lover rather than a vengeful one. I wonder, I don't know. But I don't know, maybe Vedrfolnir, knowing the future, wanted to drive Rerir to his destiny by egging him on to ensure that he would become one of the 5 sinners as he predicted. The reason why I find Rerir to be very intriguing as a character is that I feel like his characterization was written to be very coherent. Just as he felt trapped by his circumstances in the past, now he seems on the surface to be more agentic in taking matters into his own hands, but in reality he has become a slave to his obsessions. It's implied that he barely even has a consciousness anymore. He's been possessed by the abyss in a sense. So until now, he's still rather weak-willed if you think about it. Contrast that with Rinadaughter and Sertalogi, who seem to still be quite lucid even after taking on vastly different forms. I'm not saying that Rerir turned out this way because he was weak-willed. I mean, I don't think he could have foreseen that he'd be split into fragments. But I think it's the writer's way of creating some sort of poetic justice. Like, it makes sense in a literary way that this is what the fate of Rerir looks like. To illustrate my point further, I want to cite some counterexamples, those being Wanderer and Risley. There are people who took matters into their own hands despite their tough circumstances. Sure, they've done things in the past due to feeling forced by their circumstances, but they went through the process of taking accountability and going on the path of redemption, which requires effort and a strong ownership of their decision making. For Wanderer, that's regaining his memories and turning over a new leaf, and for Risley, that's serving his sentence in prison. When you go through this process, there's no room for you to continue acting in bad faith, because you can only truly change your life and your fate if you believe you have the power to do so. I'd also include Arlecchino as an example of this, even though she's more morally grey. I wouldn't say she exactly underwent a path of redemption because she's still with the Fatui and she still runs an assassin training center, even if she could have defected by now. But you can see that she does things very intentionally. You can tell that she's still with the Fatui because she feels like she can get something out of her affiliation with them, and she's not just there because she has nowhere else to go. She runs the House of the Hearth the way she wants to, including both the wholesome and the more intimidating aspects of it. Meanwhile, Rerir isn't in a position to do either anymore. As of now, it doesn't seem like redemption is in the cards for him, nor is it possible for him to kinda do good alongside his obsession to dilute his evil. That could change if ever he gains lucidity and has people around him teach him the importance of being accountable for his own actions. But without going through a lot of self-reflection first, Rerir can't take full control over his life yet. And that's what makes his story even more tragic beyond his descent into evil. Because he didn't just succumb to the darkness, he lost his soul and his sense of humanity as well. After witnessing Rerir's memories unfold, Nefer had this to say: "A monster created by circumstances is a monster all the same." She doesn't say it outright, but it's an implicit recognition of accountability, I think. Circumstances don't just give us a free pass to excuse our immoral actions. They still affect the world after all, whether we rejoice in the destruction or not. This is different from like the trolley problem, where we're forced to choose between killing either 1 or 5 people. In that situation, you kind of really have no choice. But if the choice is between, let's say, handling the finances of a company that engages in illegal activity, or quitting that company even if it puts your stable lifestyle at risk, then your choices do matter because the morally upright choice is still available to you. Heck, even real-life assassins were able to find the strength to defect and speak out against their old bosses. If you're a Filipino, you can search up Edgar Matobato as an example. So, while in recent years, we've seen a rise in sympathetic origin stories or backstories for villains, let's not forget that it's not exactly circumstances alone that create evil people. It's really their attitude or the response to their circumstances that tips them over the edge, because there will always be a more principled person in the same tough situation who will have the courage to make the right decision. So with this, I hope Rerir's story will serve as a cautionary tale against falling into the trap of bad faith rationalizations. Of course, you guys won't likely be faced with the same situation as Rerir was, and if you were, I know doing the right thing is much easier said than done. But if we practice owning up to our choices, even in tough circumstances, that'll help us better deal with situations where choosing to do what's right is hard but not life-threatening. With situations that involve corruption especially, taking a risk for justice is tough but still doable. So we have to develop the courage to prepare ourselves to take a stand when we face these sorts of ethical dilemmas. Because it will be this choice that will either set us apart from or put us in the same category as these evil people who call the shots. Wow, that was quite heavy, but I hope you guys found this insightful. If you have any thoughts you'd like to share, you could comment them down below to engage in a discussion with my other viewers. If you found this analysis interesting, I hope you could consider checking out my collection of videos, and maybe you can even subscribe to my channel if you like the kinds of content I make. That's all for today, and I guess I'll see you in my next vid whenever I feel inspired to make another one.